with demand expected to come back, the question remains, does this mean the economy is back on track?
Companies now, after experimenting with offshore in places like India, Philippines, and Poland, want to bring those jobs back.
We invest in the U.S. We're the biggest exporter in the country. In the cycle we're in right now, we're creating jobs.
From Radio America, it's Neil Asbury's Made in America, the show that explores American industry, large and small, and promotes American-made products everywhere. Put Neil Asbury's Made in America to work for you.
A very big welcome to you today. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Roffman. Hey, Rich, man, I've been watching this thing in Venezuela unfold. And I've been really glued to it. I mean, it's incredible to watch what's going to happen next. And, you know, in our country right now, you know, you're talking about Democrat socialists. And there's really a movement in the United States to make us like Venezuela. You know, I cannot believe that. I mean, if you look at some of these, like from space, and you look at the globe, right? And you see North Korea and South Korea. You know, the difference between good and evil. I mean, one is totally dark and the other one is lit up and vibrant. And now you take a look at Colombia and you take a look at Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela, with all of their blackouts and brownouts, they don't even have electricity. One of the richest countries in the world, and they cannot even produce electricity. Yet there's those in our country who want us to be more like Venezuela instead of Colombia. They want us to be like North Korea instead of South Korea. Rich, I just can't get it.
Well, no, to me, it's a very, very sad state that we have people who can, you know, in a free society, see what's going on in countries that are totalitarian and socialist in nature, and see how bad it's been run down into the ground. I mean, I do know a bunch about Venezuela. I've been there many, many, many times. Stopped when Chavez came in, but remember when I had Latin Trade and Latin CEO magazines, I used to go down there for day trips for business, and I'd go down there for 2 or 3 days at a time. It was an extremely vibrant society. It led the way economically in Latin America, and I would say almost contemporaneously I would put Chile into that as well. But Chile came out on the other side and did fairly well. Venezuela went into the tank. And so when I listened to, you know, AOC, Cortez say, yeah, she can't even condemn Maduro, and she can't support the idea of removal of this totalitarian dictator. I find that to be very, 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 very worrisome. I mean,
very
not just pathetic; it's worrisome that in a society that's educated can actually look at this and say, well, you know, I don't know, maybe it's, you know, U.S.-led coup or something, and maybe it's not a bad thing. You know, Bernie's the same way. Bernie Sanders.
Very, 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 very amazing. Hey, look, we're going to continue this conversation with Fulton Armstrong. He's with the American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. He's also a former national intelligence officer, worked a lot on Venezuela, knows a lot about what's going down there. And what happens if Maduro is removed, and what would Venezuela look like then? Is that the solution, or is there a lot more to it than just that? Hey, Fulton, welcome to Made in America.
Happy to be here.
So how do you read things in Venezuela right now? Is Maduro going to be able to weather this out, or will he ultimately go, and what happens next?
Well, it's a great question. It's a great story with very serious implications for Venezuela, but also for South America and for the United States. First, just to roll back the tape a little bit here. They call themselves socialists, but the fact is that neither Chavez nor Maduro really established the normal credentials of socialism. They had a lot of nationalism and a lot of social spending and stuff. What most of us, I believe, who've been watching Venezuela over the decades believe is that its bigger disease isn't some weird form of socialism, which they call Bolivarianism. It's actually that it is a rentier state. It's a state under any political persuasion, going back to the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, whose economy is centered about one export commodity, and that is oil, which perverts the economy, perverts all politics, perverts all the culture, and it leaves the country vulnerable to serious disruptions, either by the left or the right, as we're seeing in Venezuela. The current trend, if you look at it from the 1980s, there was a serious drop in oil. And what happened? Change of government. In the late 90s, another serious drop in oil, change of government. That's 1999 is when Chavez came in. Chavez went from $25 a barrel to $161 a barrel. And he then built the economy over this astronomical increase in oil prices and set it up then for failure in a massive way when oil prices went down. They did go down just as the time as Maduro took office, and it's been a horrible ride down, not just for Maduro politically, but for the Venezuelan people as well. Where does it go from here? One could safely say that Maduro's custodianship of the economy has been so dismal that it's impossible to see how he's going to stay in power. There's pretty much a consensus that his model, his extravagant spending and massive mismanagement and corruption, and then his aggressive authoritarian tactics against opponents simply aren't going to work. The problem is what should come after and how should that be achieved? Okay, so what U.S. policy has been is to change the regime, to bring in a new government, but the objective could be quibbled with. Could not be, I think everybody knows that we have to have change. But the way they've done it has actually made change harder, and it's going to make it more violent when it happens.
So, Rich, I mean, you've been there. I mean, I've been there a lot too. I mean, so what is your perspective? I mean, if they were to change, I mean, let's face it. I mean, Chavez, I mean, he built an incredible police state down there, and it is dangerous. Yeah. It is very dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I was listening to our guest talk about this, and Chile had a monopoly on copper. It still does. But they controlled their government controlled their nationalism of the copper industry in a much different way than the Venezuelans have controlled the oil and petroleum industry out of the ground out of Venezuela. Furthermore, Chavez and Maduro and his cronies, treated the state oil money as a slush fund for themselves. So. And their cronies,
and for all their boondoggles. I mean, look at look at what they've given to Cuba.
Yeah, well, those are good questions. Copper represented maybe 15% of Chile's export.
That's right.
Oil represents 98%. So the perversion factor, if you will, is great. As for subsidies for oil, I think you're exactly right that Cuba has gotten a more generous subsidy because they had a barter deal with Venezuela. They would do doctors, trainers, teachers, etc. Probably the Venezuelans paid a little bit more than they should have, and then gave the Cubans a deeper discount on oil. But you should know, if you've been in and out of Venezuela, that Venezuela has always had agreements to subsidize oil for most of the Caribbean and Central American countries. Previously, under previous governments, it was called the San Jose Accord. And those numbers are more generous, have been more generous under Chavez and Maduro, because, frankly, oil prices never got up to the $150, $160 level before. So just to maintain a steady flow, the subsidies did increase quite significantly. What did that do? That fueled massive corruption in many of the receiver states, including Nicaragua, of course, where you have a huge example. But Haiti, if you've been watching Haiti, they've been having massive demonstrations, probably you could call them riots, over how that oil money, that oil supply also made their political situation a total mess. So you're right. So the point here is that rentier economies export their rentier culture.
I have a question. I have a question.
Rich, go ahead.
I want to ask Fulton this question. And one of my good friends who's a very successful businessman in upstate New York, Vincent, and he came up with a concept. I want to run it by Fulton. Why can't we absorb more Venezuelans into the United States? Because obviously these people need to get out of Venezuela, or those who can want to. What are the odds of that happening? And would that not in your benefit to the current administration in terms of trying to have people understand the difference between socialism and capitalism? Is there any validity to trying to encourage these people to come here en masse?
Well, there's already a serious debate in the administration on whether to offer temporary protected status to the 75,000 Venezuelans who are already here. I think generally history shows that the absorption of immigrants is a very positive thing for the United States. I don't think that it would have a major impact in the case of Venezuela because the people who are most affected are the lower and the lower middle class people. As you probably know, 3 million refugees have departed Venezuela in the last 5 years. Some context, however, is, and it's not given the right profile in the information, Venezuela has been the home to 5.5 million Colombian refugees since the 1980s. What's happening now is, as things are getting bad in Venezuela, most of those people are trying to go home or want to go home. But immigration, does it solve internal problems? No, because in a way, it releases pressure on the problematic government to solve the problems. People
and all the brain and a lot of the brain power ends up immigrating out of the country that ultimately they're going to need it to rebuild the country. Fulton, do you have a moment to stay around? I got to ask you about the geopolitical context of this. I can't let you go until I hear that, if you have the time.
Sure, of course I do.
Okay. Hey, folks, we're going to be right back with Fulton Armstrong, Senior Fellow at the American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, also a former National Intelligence Officer. We're talking about Venezuela and the impact to our economy, to our jobs, to our relationships around the world. You don't want to miss it.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. Hey, folks, continue to buckle up here, man. We've got a great conversation going on with Fulton Armstrong, I should say Professor Armstrong, Senior Fellow at American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, former National Intelligence Officer. Very, very great, insightful discussion going on right now about Venezuela. Hey, look, I mean, this is a major thing. I mean, and there has been a lot of immigration out of Venezuela. I mean, I can see that in South Florida. They're becoming a very, very large contingency down here. And they're all very much supporting President Trump. I mean, I got to tell you, his approval rating in South Florida is going way up because he is taking a stand against Maduro in his policies. And he's become very popular down here with the immigrant population, especially from South America, Colombia. They want an American president to stand up to evil and to wrong. So let me ask you, Fulton, how does this play in the geopolitical context? I mean, with Russia, with China, for that matter, and because they're continuing to support the Maduro regime. Whereas the United States has gotten a very large coalition of countries, I believe it's over 50, that's actually now recognized Guaido as the rightful Venezuelan president until new elections can be called. But China and Russia are still hanging on to the old guard here.
I think you're right. They're holding on to the old guard because the old guard owes them money. The old guard owes them quite a bit of money. In the case of Russia, one of the Russian oil companies has a $5 or $6 billion investment. This is irony upon irony upon irony, because Venezuela sits on the world's single biggest reserves belonging to one nation, 330-something bazillion barrels worth, and they have had to borrow money from Russia in order to keep pumping the oil, $5 or $6 billion to the Rosneft company from them. And there's a little bit of a trade debt as well as there. In the case of China, they owe China at least $60 billion, and some estimates go up to $70 billion. They don't want to lose that $60 or $7 billion, frankly. The other thing is the geostrategic sort of, let's see if the Americans trip themselves up, cynicism that China and Russia bring to their foreign policy, and that is if the U.S. is going to do something like invade Venezuela, it will poison the pool all of South America. These 50-something nations that have recognized the legitimacy of Guaido, who was the democratically elected legitimate president of the National Assembly, are also saying, well, he's the last man standing. Let him be interim president until a serious new president can be selected. But that coalition, which hasn't cost them anything, will evaporate, and the U.S. will be left holding the sack of fecal matter alone if military intervention happens.
Hey, Rich, do you think that we will? I don't think we're going to have a military intervention. I think that, is it off the table? I don't see it coming. Rich, what do you think?
I don't think it's off the table, and I think the implication that the threat is there needs to stay where it is right now. But I would think, and I think our guest would agree, that would be the absolute last resort for this country to get involved that way. If you think about it, Venezuela is a different ballgame than some of the other environments. For one thing, it's an educated society. It's a great society. The Venezuela, I've employed a lot of Venezuelan people over the years, and they're just terrific people. They're well represented in the banking field in South Florida and in the investment field in South Florida. So I think given the opportunity and the leadership that they seem to be piecing together, that we see, then you would think they'd be able to get this under control for themselves, albeit it's going to be ugly. And I'm just wondering if Maduro is going to go ahead and force a volatile confrontation, because the optics look good for him in the sense that he can blame it on the United States. What do you think?
Fulton, what do you think? What do you think? Very important point.
That's a good point, that he could make himself the martyr. And we then explain the destruction of the Venezuelan economy, which is 90% his. It's now 10% ours, because we've taken away all of his resources and stuff like that. But you're right. I also believe that the military option would be disastrous, and it would be the last resort. The problem is that the policy has led with all things on the table, and that has been counterproductive to swaying the military, because they thought the military were just venal and corrupt officers that Maduro had bought off and Chavez had bought off as well. It's not really true. The military is corrupt. It was corrupt before Chavez as well, let's be honest. But you don't sway them by threatening them with intervention or threatening to throw them in jail, etc. So in a way, you're sort of right. It'd be really great if we could have the impact of threatened invasion, but we're not having it. And so now we're sort of stuck. We put a red line in the sand on humanitarian developments. We put a red line down, and they walked all over it. We put another red line down on Guaido returning. They walked all over it and stuff. They haven't arrested him. But what is the policy? What does this administration really want? And why does it continue to strengthen Maduro rather than not? This blackout this last week has all the markings of sabotage upon which could have been very simple, because under Maduro the system is in such horrible shape, like Puerto Rico after the hurricane. But right now Chavez is milking these things to say to people, look, this is what Guaido and the Americans are going to do to us if they come in here.
Yeah, very fascinating, Fulton. Very fascinating. Boy, we're going to be watching by. I hope in 60 days, I hope in 30 days, I hope in 2 weeks, I hope tomorrow that Guaido is the president in the interim capacity. But I don't know, man. I don't know. He's just got too many buttons to push.
Yeah, but the terror button and the totalitarian, authoritarian buttons don't work in a crisis like this. You can scare a certain number of people, but when everybody looks at all their neighbors are miserable, it doesn't work. I hope that you invite me back in 30 or 60 days to talk about who's going to win a real good election in which the entire array of political parties can run, in which the military is a respected adjudicator and arbiter in the situation, and in which we haven't had to invade or do blackouts or whatever pressure we're also doing.
Well, Fulton, incredible. I'm going to take you up on that. Phil's going to get a hold of you. We're going to get you back in 30 days from now. We're not going to wait for 60. We're going to get back in 30 days, and we're going to figure this whole thing out. Fulton Armstrong, Senior Fellow at American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. Fulton, thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Coming up, we got Jon Miltimore from the Foundation for Economic Education. You're not going to believe this topic. Big labor and the Green New Deal. Big labor's not behind it. Stay tuned.
Made in America.
Sharply higher at the open, stocks continued to perform well over the course of the day Tuesday.
And I think that bodes well here over the next couple of years for having bigger demands coming to this country.
Now, more of Neal Asbury's Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Ruffin. Hey, Rich, man, I about fell off my seat earlier this week, when I saw big labor really lashing out on the Green New Deal. I mean, imagine that. I mean, we've been talking about this, I think, every week since it was released. And, talking about, how ridiculous it is, how costly it is, and how it would put us into the dark ages. I mean, we wouldn't have electricity in our country anymore. I don't know. We wouldn't have airplanes, right? I don't know if we'd have cows. They'd slaughter them, because of, I guess, of all of the heat-trapping gases that they happen to give off. I mean, can it get any more crazy than this?
It can. I mean, I can't wait to see the adventures that are going to occur in this country as we get closer to the 2020 election. I said, as we move forward, cycling into the new House members, that we're going to see things that we've never, one would only imagine, that you'd see. And we're seeing them right now. It's just amazing. I mean, I'm watching Nancy Pelosi age in front of me. I just think it's hysterical.
But I tell you, if the Democrats lose big labor, I mean, it's lights out. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the Democrats, have some trouble here. How do you keep, these sort of junior freshman members of Congress in control and at the same time appeal to the greater American good, the greater American society? I don't know if you can do that. It's almost a tough circle to square.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. But we're gonna talk about that right now.
We're gonna talk about it right now with Jon Miltimore, who's a managing editor at the Foundation for Economic Education, otherwise known as FEE.org. Hey, John, and also you do a lot of writing. Wall Street Journal, CNN, Forbes, Fox, Washington Times. Great stuff, great work. But let's talk about big labor in the Green New Deal. I mean, they really came out swinging. They said, no way, no how. This is stupid stuff. But yet it's a core Democrat priority right now. I mean, it's being mimicked by all the presidential hopefuls. I mean, how do you reconcile this?
Yeah, I think there's a few things at work, Neil. First, I think big labor was pretty upset they weren't even consulted on the legislation. I guess it's more of a resolution than an actual bill. But they said, hey, we've been part of this for a long time. You better be talking to us, when you unveil something this large. And, the second point is the AFL-CIO has about 12 million members, and they're going to be affected by this a lot should something like this go forward. And I think, as pretty much all Americans would be, if you look at the resolution, it's, I finally went and read it myself. I'd read about it, read some articles on it. But when I finally went and read every word, it's about 2,000 words long, and it reads more like a manifesto than any kind of legislation. But there's, it pretty much would affect every part of the U.S. economy.
Well, yeah. I mean, it can you imagine when the head of the AFL-CIO saw this and said, let me see, wait a minute. So there'll be no fossil fuel, so all those jobs are going to be gone. Then we can't be flying, so that affects all the aeronautics industry. And that affects also the people who work in the airlines. So that's about 500,000 jobs just for the airlines right there. Then, of course, it's going to eliminate the cars in the United States. Oh, well, that's also going to eliminate, companies like, Caterpillar and John Deere, because you can't have any fossil fuels and the engines working on the farms. So that's going to go back to horses. But wait a minute, you can't have horses because that's going to give off methane. methane, we can't have the cow, so we kill Elsie the Borden cow, which is very un-American, by the way. So that eliminates ice cream. The kids are going to start crying. So when you cut across the entire economy, I mean, think about this. When you cut across the entire economy, everything's out, everything's gone, everyone's out of business. So I would think the AFL would take umbrage, at the very least, to what AOC, pretended to write, by the way.
Yeah, Richard Trump is no dummy. He knows that his workers are going to be affected by this, and you can see now congressional members are starting to chirp about it. More and more are starting to voice reservations, if not outright opposition to this.
But let's be fair here. I mean, there was a Gallup poll just recently, and now that the country is getting introduced to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, otherwise known as AOC, her favorability ratings are plummeting, right? Well, there's about 30% of the people in the country who actually think she's got some good ideas, and that would be the hard left. I mean, that's the hard left. And then everybody else is against her. Well, she has a negative 68% favorability rating. I mean, that's like, America's not buying into this stuff, John.
Neil, I actually hadn't seen that poll. That's kind of encouraging.
It was just out today.
Positive reports. I keep seeing how popular she is and what a rock star she is. So if people are starting to wake up and actually look at her ideas, that's positive.
Well, they got a big problem here, John. I mean, coming up in 2020, I mean, if that's the standard bearer of your party and that's, who you're leading with, and she's got a negative 68 favorability, 30% of the country, the hard left supporter and nobody else. And that's who's setting the agenda for you. I mean, that's not looking too pretty. And what is she saying also? Hey, look, we're going to put primaries in front of any of the moderate Democrats that don't support our agenda. That means they're all toast.
Well, the whole thing is so. By the way, Beto supports this. Beto said, he totally agrees with this. By the way, the co-founder of Greenpeace.
Well, Rich, all the other ones too.
Well, yeah, wait a minute.
Booker,
the co-founder of Greenpeace,
Kamala Harris. They're all drinking the Kool-Aid, man. They can never win a national election with this sort of proposition.
What does it mean?
They couldn't get cap and trade. They couldn't even get, when they controlled Congress, they couldn't even get cap and trade through.
What does it mean when the co-founder of Greenpeace calls AOC a pompous little twit? He's not holding his words back. He said that clear. Patrick Moore. She's a pompous little twit who doesn't quite understand the reality of life. So, yeah, very strange.
So, John, how do you go into an election with this sort of this around your neck, this anchor around your neck?
Well, I think probably right now, I think if you talk to party insiders, they would say this is the worst. And let me just say, I'm not in politics. I'm not active in politics. I know some people who are. And if you talk to the party insiders, they'd say this is probably a worst case scenario. This is not what you want to be leading into a presidential election with this kind of message at the forefront. I'm sure it will energize their base a lot. I think there are, that you will see some of the hard left, excited by this message. This won't be appealing to independents, and I think it's going to be a pretty tough for the 2020 presidential candidates to navigate this.
Yeah, hey, John, we got to make a short break here. We're with Jon Miltimore, managing editor at the Foundation for Economic Education. We're talking about jobs, your jobs, and the Green New Deal, and how they would decimate your jobs. You don't want to miss it.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman, and we're joined with Jon Miltimore, managing editor at the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE.org. You can see his work. He's been greatly published in all the various media outlets, and we're talking about your jobs. We're talking about the Green New Deal and what it would mean if we ever adopted even part of this, and how devastating that would be to our economy. So, John, let's talk about our economy. Let's talk about our jobs. It does look like the United States and China seem to be inching towards some sort of an agreement. And if we do, I personally subscribe that it's going to unleash an economic boom in our country like we've never seen before. And hey, look, we've been 10 years into a growth cycle, but now with this, oh my goodness, it's going to be absolutely amazing. I really believe there's a lot of runway in this economy. I believe there's still a lot more jobs to create, and really good paying jobs with benefits, and those that you can raise a family with and enjoy life and have access to the American dream. On the other side, though, the antithesis to that scenario that I just laid out is the Green New Deal. It will take away everything. It will take away the energy in our economy and our country. And my goodness, it would be a very, very different place. I mean, as far as the jobs that we create, the type of jobs, how much those jobs pay. And it would just, forget about raising a family and having vacations and doing all the wonderful things that we love to do, going places, seeing things, going to our national parks, all the great things that Americans love to do and that we have access to if we just have an economy that works. And right now we do. So, John, what is the risk here to those jobs, to this economy that we have, if we get anywhere near a Green New Deal?
Well, I think the first thing you have to look at, we have a $22 trillion debt as is right now. We have entitlement spending that's projected to be a big problem here the next decade or two. And I say the next decade or two, it's a problem now, but it's going to get much worse. Economic growth is the only way that we're going to have the ability to meet those obligations. And I think, the right policy is to first do no harm right now. And that means freeing up markets to get the kind of growth that you're going to need to pay those bills that we've already accrued. Legislation like the Green New Deal would be the exact opposite of what we need right now.
So, Richie, we're talking about what, 70% tax rates? I mean, even 70% tax rates wouldn't be enough because the economy would be shrinking so fast that you couldn't tax the American people enough to try to create the revenue to run our government and to invest in our society.
Neal.
We would be crashing. There's, 70% to zero is still zero.
It doesn't really matter whether it's 70, 60, 50, 80, 90. There will be no economy. I mean, as Patrick Moore pointed out in his piece, calling her a pompous little twit, I wasn't joking, but this is serious. He said, let me be clear on that. If fossil fuels were banned, every tree in the world, at least around here would be cut down for fuel, for cooking, heating, and so forth. That alone would bring about massive death and starvation and so forth. People just don't understand. If you don't have combustion engines, you can't deliver. If you can't deliver, you were saying, well, we couldn't take vacations and go to national parks. For Christ's sake, you won't be able to go to public supermarkets because that won't exist, because the food won't exist. I mean, you have to understand the reality. If you stop the economy, it stops. Go look at the Dust Bowls from the 1930s out in the leaves of grass, the sea of grass and so forth, out in the Midwest. It's gone. And why? Because we can't even use petroleum products to get the crops born. We can't even go to a hospital and try and use a petrochemical product such as an IV. Well, you can't have that because that comes from, petrochemicals. And that you can't do. So when you look at this in its totality, you realize that, truly, as A.E. Hausman said, Terrence, this really is, I added that part, stupid stuff.
Yeah, it's really, people aren't exaggerating when they all the doom, like mostly we know how media works. People exaggerate and there's a lot of hyperbole. That's really not the case here. When you actually look at what this says, when you talk about things like completely transitioning off fossil fuels in 10 years, that's not going to happen. And so if you tried to do that, people would die. Like, you would have a huge energy crisis. And I don't like going into, the apocalyptic scenarios. But I also want to make it clear that this is dangerous stuff. It really is. And people better wake up and realize that.
Hey, Jon, thanks for being on the show. Wonderful guest. Keep up the great work. Jon Miltimore, managing editor at the Foundation for Economic Education, otherwise known as FEE. You can read him. He's well published, and he's going to be back on Made in America here real soon. Hey, Jon, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Neal. Have a good weekend, gentlemen.
Be good. Hey, Dr. Rothman and I are going to be back in just a moment. Can't believe it's segment 5, but this show is not done. Stick around. We still got a lot to go.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rupp. So, Rich, where do we go from there? I mean, how do you really top that one? I mean, absolutely incredible, right? I mean, this whole Green New Deal and, what they're saying and doing. And, they're serious, though. I mean, that's what makes it so unbelievable is that they're saying this stuff with a straight face. I mean, they really believe this stuff.
Well, it is such an outrageous scenario that we're in. I mean, I do find, we talked about Venezuela and socialism, which leads to communism, which leads to death and destruction. And if you just study your history, socialism is probably one of the greatest causes of massive death in the world. I mean, look at what we did in terms of 70 million Chinese were killed with Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution. Joe Stalin, not to be confused with, Uncle Joe here. Joe Stalin killed over 60 million people as a result. The concept of central planning. We know by studying history that all of that concept, all these great ideas that Marx and Engels and others came out with, and then they used the students in the Russian Revolution, and they called them useful idiots, which they are. They're used. Just produced nothing. They produced death and destruction, and ultimately it was a very, very bad scenario for, what do they call it? Why did they call it the Red Curtain? Why did they call it the Iron Curtain? There's a reason for that, because that curtain kept people in to become slaves to the state and ultimately die. Why is it that when they call themselves now, socialist Democrats, Neal, well, last I remember when we had East and West Berlin, the East Berlin side were called Socialist Democrats, Democrat Socialists. And I do remember seeing people getting shot and killed on top of that wall as a result of Socialist Democrats in a failed society, in a failed economy. When you look at North Korea and South Korea, the sky is lit up at night. Go looking south to South Korea, and you look north, and it's dark. Why is that? Because of socialism and communism, totalitarianism, and central planning, and oh no, this is for the greater good. What greater good? Give up my rights that my forefathers fought for, to give me the ability to think and do things on my own, to make my own destiny? Good, bad, or indifferent. Why would anybody want to give all that up? Decades and generations and hundreds of years of fighting for the right, the ability to just think for yourself and self-determination. And we're going to give that up for someone named AOC, coming from Queens and Bronx, who won by 15,000 votes? You've got to be absolutely kidding me. Sad. Very sad.
Yeah, but, Rich, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's everything you said. I mean, exclamation mark. You're right. But I also know, like I said earlier, that America will do the right thing. And America's waking up. I mean, this is not something, they're not going to pull the wool over the eyes of the American people. They know what we have. We've got an incredible country, a great country. We got a great economy. As an entrepreneur, go out there and try to hire people today. Everybody with a pulse rate who wants a job is working. And the best is not yet here. I mean, there's still so many great things yet to come. I mean, the economy is still just kind of just chugging along. I mean, we haven't even hit third gear yet. This thing and this economy has got so much room to improve. And people see that, and they're working. And, I just think that the tables have started to turn. I think you're starting to see it in the polls. And even the polls are largely controlled by the left and by the progressives, they still can't hide this. It's coming out that the American people are rejecting this whole thing. and our friends like from the Job Creators Network, I mean, they've been on our show, great people, putting up the billboards on Times Square and all over New York City and reminding New Yorkers about the billions and billions and billions of dollars that New York City lost, that Long Island City that can desperately need it. If you've ever been there, it needs these jobs. It needs this investment. The American people are seeing that. They're being reminded of it, and they're taking note. And I got to tell you, I think Democrats, are going to have a rude awakening if they continue to embrace this nonsense, which means no jobs, and whatever jobs are left are not paying anything because this country is so broke, we don't have any money anymore.
Well, in short, I agree with everything you just said. Next.
So anyway, Rich, it's always great to be together. It's always great to let the passions flow. We had a wonderful show today. Once again, it's over too quickly. But don't be sad. We're going to be back again next week at the same time for another adventure of Made in America, where we never stop fighting for your jobs.